Jack Frost in 1997 is a film that is probably more well known by people who have not seen it than by those who have. If you were a child anytime between 1997 to whenever your local video store phased out stocking VHS tapes, then you will almost certainly remember this lenticular cover, maybe even more than you would your happiest childhood moments. It is to me the most memorable box art of any direct-to-video horror of that era, in a time that was known for its unique box art. The movie didn't even have to be good. In fact, you may be surprised to learn that it's not. But with this piece of amazing marketing, it was already determined to basically be a rental hit. And this is, far from the only VHS that tried this type of cover in this time. But it was, in my opinion, by far the most effective. For example, Uncle Sam from this same distribution company had a similar lenticular effect, and what's funny in that is that the design for this cover, similar to the design for the Jack Frost cover, is also not featured in the final film. It's just to sell copies, and even though it is trickery, it still worked. This movie was everywhere. In every video store that I ever went to, they had a copy of Jack Frost. And despite a lot of the film kind of being garbage, its cover art alone cemented it along with other films like Leprechaun, Dr. Giggles, and The Video Dead, many from the Full Moon catalog, and a whole host of other horror sequels as staples of that VHS era that have remained somewhat within the cultural memory of today within horror spaces. Presentation and style is everything. Do you think the Goosebumps would have hit the status that it did without Tim Jacobus's paintings mixed with the excellent graphic design work that accompanied them? No, it wouldn't, as evident by the fact that they have continued to print Goosebumps books for the past 2 decades, with different artists and different art styles. But the franchise stopped being culturally relevant the moment that he left the project, and even started to drop off after they changed the graphic design, keeping Jacobus's art but incorporating the off-putting Goosebumps 2000 branding. To be honest, even though some of them are amazing, a lot of those early Goosebumps books aren't even very good, truth be told, and that's judging them on their own playing field as children's literature. But that didn't matter, not when you had marketing like this. The financial success story of the Jack Frost films is very compelling to me. It is a would-be franchise that essentially coasted to the finish line off of favors and goodwill combined with a lot of good luck. They have publicly joked before that a lot of films have larger craft services catering budgets than what they spent on this entire production, and yet, they were able to make something that is at least admirable and has stood the test of time as an underground cult hit. But that is not how this whole thing started. In fact, Jack Frost was an idea that floated around for years before it actually got made. Rennie Harlan was even at one point attached to direct this first attempt at the film, who directed the vastly underrated The Long Kiss Goodnight. He wanted to make another movie with his wife at the time, Gina Davis, and he thought that Jack Frost might be a fun project for that, but she reportedly hated the script, so instead they made the lavishly expensive Cutthroat Island instead. They had a budget of over 3 times what was being proposed for Jack Frost. A movie that was so disastrous that it bankrupted Carlico Pictures, who had made both massive hits and culturally relevant films in the past decade and a half, such as The Changeling, Shogun, First Blood, Total Recall, Showgirls, Stargate, and Terminator 2. So, he probably should have just stuck with directing Jack Frost instead. In this original version, Jack Frost would have been CGI for the majority of the time, and would have had even more abilities to change from snow to water to vapor depending on what was necessary to kill his prey. Apparently, the convincing effects of 1991's Terminator 2 gave the crew and studio enough confidence that this could potentially be achieved, even though the initial concept and development of the film started back in 1989, which is one of the reasons that they were seemingly at one point thinking of trying to work with Carlico in the first place, mixed with the fact that the studio had just found success recently with a similar supernatural killer movie, Wes Craven's Shocker. But as things often do, this deal eventually fell into development hell, and once Harlan and Davis left the picture, it seemed as if it was destined to never be made. Eventually, those in power lost interest in the project. It exchanged hands a number of times and shifted gears with the same basic concept that was retooled into a family drama, resulting in the very weird 1998 Michael Keaton Jack Frost film that was made under a producer who was attached to that original 1989 horror version. In conversation with Michael Gingold of Fangoria in 2019, writer and director of the film Michael Cooney said on the production of the film, "Jack Frost was the most fun I ever had. It started off as a big budget production. There was going to be a Hollywood director attached to it, and it was right when Terminator 2 had come out. So there were going to be all these special effects of the serial killer made of snow and ice and water. That then fell apart, and a year or so later someone said, 'Can you make it for $500,000? We said, oh yeah, sure, we can do that, no problem. No one else would direct that, so I said, oh, I'll do it. And as we started to go into production, we said, look, for $500,000, we are not going to be able to make this a serious, dramatic, scary piece. We looked at the snowman we had created and felt, we have to be faithful to what that snowman is. That snowman isn't scary. If it's killing people, that's going to be terrible for the characters, but it ain't frightening. So we had to take that on board. I think the original Jack Frost has this lovely, confident tone in what it is. It knows it's not trying to be serious, and everyone involved knew that they were making the same movie. The one character I think is well formed is the lead, the sheriff, beautifully portrayed by Chris Alport, whom I surrounded with a bunch of loonies. That was the idea. You had one central character who was trying to be sane with all these oddballs around him. It was so much fun to do. And this is honestly kind of an amazing way to approach this kind of thing. Everyone in this movie is acting legitimately insane. At times it's even on the same level as something like the 1960s Adam West Batman, but it also weirdly works. It very much has the feel of a Hallmark movie, almost, that's just 20% off of where it should be, which has this great effect. He's also right that Christopher Alport kills this role. He is so fun in these movies, and they wouldn't be the same thing had he not been in them. He also sadly and ironically died soon after the production of the second film in an avalanche while on a skiing trip, which was one of the many reasons that the proposed third film fell apart before it went into production. The story of the film is about Jack Frost, an insane serial killer, who is on his way to be executed by the state for his crimes as the film begins. The truck that is transporting him through a raging blizzard accidentally slams into another vehicle that, just so happens to be carrying an experimental scientific chemical that can bring back the dead and mutate genetics. And wouldn't you know it, Jack Frost happens to get splashed with the stuff and melts into the snow, being reborn into the murderous living snowman, who wreaks havoc on the nearby town in his path of getting revenge on the local sheriff, Sam Tiller, who put him away and sent him to death row. Real Marvel Comics kind of concept, but one that you absolutely accept and buy into. As Cooney said, they knew what kind of thing they were making here, and if you're putting in a copy of Jack Frost to watch at home, you also know what you're expecting. Cooney would also elaborate on this idea, and the tone of the piece and how aspirations conflict with budgets in conversations with Justin Beam. We then had this script that was full of these digital effects and things you couldn't do on this budget. The first thing was we had to streamline the script for this extremely low budget. The next thing that happened was we actually saw the snowman. Way at the beginning of pre-production, it was still in our heads that we could make quite a nasty horror movie, and that there would be a bunch of good kills. And then we saw it. There's a long story about how we spent all our money at this one company that was supposed to make all these Jack Frosts, but they just made the one snowman, 3 balls of snow. We had no money to make any more, and we looked at this thing and we thought, that's just not scary. This was before we had actors, quite early on. We realized we were going to have to embrace it. We put something like $50,000 of our seed money into this company, and literally had like 3 balls of foam. We had to do some rethinking. I hope I embraced it well. People who get the movie understand what we were making. I both love and hate the opening of this movie for different reasons. The opening credits being done as ornaments is a great textural detail. I love when any work of art can do little personalized things like this and go the extra mile. Even with a lesser work, those little things can build such a personal identity. They can still elevate it and make it special. And this looks great and was one of the best ideas that the film had. They only did this though because they literally did not have the budget to outsource a company to make the opening credits for them, and so they decided to go buy cheap ornaments at a dollar store and make the credits by hand. But it works, and you would never expect that something like this was at play here. More things should do this kind of out-of-the-box thinking on a budget. It would just improve art all around. But on top of that, you have this Christmas Eve bedtime conversation happening between an uncle and his niece that is the most grating voice acting you can imagine.
You want a happy story, or do you want a scary story?
I want a happy, scary story.
Happy, scary story.
Yeah!
I know it's camp, and I know it's being done bad on purpose. I fully recognize that. But this anime baby voice in particular is one of my least favorite sounds that I've ever experienced in my entire life. I hate that exact particular thing where an adult is pretending to be a child. It's super off-putting to me, and in my opinion should be criminalized. One of the reasons that they were able to get away with such wild decisions is that they were in a very unique situation. Their investors, Prism Entertainment, who in a normal situation would oversee the film as the producers, went bankrupt weeks before the film was to be made. The production already had the cash, and so they went ahead and just made the film without basically having to answer to anyone for approval. Zero oversight. So this makes Jack Frost one of the few rare film shoots ever in the history of cinema to have actual complete autonomy and creative freedom to do literally anything that they wanted to within the film, which they did. This ultimately ended up being somewhat of a negative thing though, as when the film was completed they had no producers to take the project to begin the distribution process, and instead had to bring the film to the bank executives who had written Prism Entertainment the loan to make the film in the first place. They wrote it off as a loss, and for 3 years the film just sat in their collection of held assets. We would have never known that this film even existed if it weren't for an event in 1997, when a man who was working in a marketing firm was looking for cheap projects to take on, and learned about the film's existence. From what I can tell, he bought the movie from the bank for $50,000, and then developed the marketing for the project and took it to IPOS Entertainment, which is a now defunct company that was known for similar movies of this nature such as Uncle Sam and Ice Cream Man. Together they put together the iconic box art, and the rest is more or less history. This is also why I suspect that the box art does not actually represent the monster in the film, because these people were not attached to the production team whatsoever, and through that probably had no access to the original suit, which honestly might not have even existed anymore. And if it did, why would you want to show it off? I've even seen it be insinuated that the original snowman costume was destroyed at the end of the production, during the filming of one of the last scenes with the exploding sheriff's station. So I imagine that they probably had to create an entirely new snowman suit just for the box photographs. So even though it was filmed in 1994, it would not be released on video until later in 97, which is why Christopher Alport ages so much between the first and second film, as a full 6 years passed between those productions even though the films were actually released within a short window of each other. Because of the limited budget, nearly everything about this movie was done completely on a jerry-rig fashion as cheap as possible. And honestly, the whole thing was kind of a bit greasy. The entire movie was shot on short ends, which I imagine would be an absolute nightmare that I would never personally want to go through. What that means is this. So back when everything was shot on film canisters usually contained between 400 and 800 feet of film, depending on what they were shooting on, which was usually equivalent to 5 to 11 minutes of footage. On major studio films, they often did not bother to shoot the entire reel, because making sure that they actually used every single frame could actually cost more money than not when you consider how many people that they would be paying to stand around with their work interrupted, while they worried about exactly how much film was left in each canister. So this loss at the end of each reel was always accounted for in a larger film's budget, once these shorter strips of film were cut out at the end of each of these reels, which were called short ends. They were given or sold to lower budget films to use that might not could afford full new film canisters, meaning that every take that they had could be no longer than roughly 30 seconds or so before they had to change the film again. It would have been an exceptionally tedious process, and one that would be difficult to manage because you have so many extra pieces of film to keep up with during the production. But that's not all that went on here with its crazed and somewhat grungy shooting. Jill's death sequence, for instance, was filmed to just be an outright slasher scene, but the snowman costume was so difficult to move around in that it looked like he was kind of just bouncing off of her instead of killing her. So in a misguided attempt to improve this, in the edit they redubbed the audio to make it to where in the finished version of the scene, the snowman is raping her to death instead of just trying to kill her with his hands. One of the guys that they auditioned to play the human version of Jack Frost became agitated at one point due to all of their questionings in that process, and so as a result, he pulled a knife on them. The scene where Jack Frost falls out of a window onto a moving truck was not a special effect, they just did it, and kind of hope for the best. That seemed to be the ethos of this film, just total punk, goofy, independent cinema. This was shot in the mountains of California during winter, but that year it happened to be hotter than was expected, with an average of 70 degrees outside in an area that typically on most years had snow. With the Blu Ray, you can often tell that they're a little sweaty in some of these outdoor daylight scenes. And so anytime that you actually see snow in this, it was made from foam, cotton, and other similar materials. And they actually did a shockingly good job with making it look convincingly cold. On Blu-ray, it doesn't hold up quite as well, but you have to keep in mind that this film was never intended to be seen in high definition. On VHS, all of these effects are completely sold, but this also had a negative impact on how they had to go about filming these scenes. Cinematographer Dean Lent said that they originally wanted the film to feel very big, with wide nature shots and full shots of the town covered in blankets of snow. But because they had to fake the snow and the cold weather, it impacted the shots that they were able to use, resulting in a film that mostly relies on close-ups and mid-shots rather than being the grandiose winter movie that they had originally desired. This also made filming the snowman quite difficult at times, because the suit was supposedly massive in person, and much larger than they had envisioned it to be, which made framing him with other people in the same shot nearly impossible to achieve while making the landscape around them feel wintry. This is one reason that you primarily just see close-ups of the snowman's hands doing things during these kill scenes, and also why lenses were often used when shooting him full body that compress the space around him. This almost has a Twin Peaks quality to it at times, and that's not just because it focuses on a small-town sheriff investigating strange murders, which, given that this was shot in 1994, was probably not a coincidence. The particular shot framing, the wooden settings, just all of it verges on being almost derivative of that show, which, as you know, is something that I'm normally not a fan of, but here is almost endearing, and I don't actually hate it. This movie is, by and large, outside of a few moments, very likable and does have a charm to it. You don't have a bad or boring time in this world. I know there was that whole controversy online about cozy horror, and I do understand the perspective of why people were upset about it, but this is absolutely a comfy horror movie from beginning to end that you can curl up into. And in base concept, I don't personally think that there's anything actually wrong with that. I think this Twin Peaksy feeling is also somewhat created by the fact that Michael Cooney is not American and is instead British. I've talked about this before, but anytime this happens, from Silent Hill to Alan Wake or with this film, when you have someone who is not American trying to do small-town American horror stories, it comes across as deeply surreal in its tone in areas that possibly work on a somewhat unintentional level. Cooney also had a previous background in writing for theater before making the transition to feature films, and I think that attention to character work and dialogue also adds a bit to this kind of strange feeling that this film has compared to other VHS titles of its day. And a lot of this was also built on the talents of these performers, who Cooney admits were crucial in delivering a watchable film, once he realized that the effects were going to be so bad. They understood what we were doing. The production was a disaster, but the actors were all fantastic and understood. Even when they walked in and saw the snowman, they trusted I would be able to find the balance of humor and horror. All in all, it's a great time all around, and there isn't really a whole lot else to be said about that. I love how you can see the ambition in the project even though they had basically no money. And they didn't let that stop them, at least in spirit. It does sort of fall apart a bit after the halfway point. They work hard to set up this tone of a competent supernatural murder mystery story, but didn't have the budget to fully commit to that. And so halfway through you have the hard shift into being a goofy Christmas slasher featuring a snowman who talks like Chucky. Not that that's a bad thing. The same thing could be said about the first Child's Play movie as well, although that film certainly handles the hard shift better than this one does. Child's Play in general is actually kind of a good way to look at this. They are essentially parallel films that start as one thing and slowly devolve into chaos, with characters who can't understand how this is happening. Even so much as going down to their son being a suspect for the supernatural killer's crimes, because internally they just cannot believe that an inanimate object is doing this. And honestly, if they had had some sequels that were able to carry this idea a bit further, we wouldn't be talking about Jack Frost like we do Chucky, but we might talk about it, I imagine, in a similar general ballpark, something akin to Leprechaun or something like that. Because when this movie works, it does so surprisingly well. You just buy it. And I think that that comes from this having its development backbone be a large budget studio film that was intended to be actually scary. The point of that movie was originally going to be a much more menacing affair. And I think that mentality helped in still keeping a strong story structure even after they made the shift into the territory of being a low-budget horror VHS comedy. And just a few years later in the year 2000, if you can believe it or not, Jack Frost 2: Revenge of the Mutant Snowman jumps the shark. You know, most franchises would have the decency to wait until at least the fourth movie before doing Snowman Goes Hawaii, but here we are doing it right away in part 2. Also, I've read that the subtitle of Revenge of the Mutant Killer Snowman was actually chosen deliberately to make sure that everyone knew that this Jack Frost 2 was not a sequel to the Michael Keaton Jack Frost from a few years previously, as they didn't want to trick any families into accidentally renting it when they were at the video store. Which is kind of an admirable thing considering that this was coming out of a time period where low-budget film studios were purposefully making derivative works in the hopes of making their money by tricking people into renting them. But before we get to that, I would like to take some time to remind you that I have recently started a second channel, IPOS DARKSIDES, where I am doing semi-weekly uploads of short-form videos on strange movies from horror's past and present. And I'd like to ask you to check that out if you like my work here. You can also support the production of videos like this on Patreon. Thank you very much for everything. The biggest complaint that you could lodge against this movie is the same that you could have made if Tommy Wiseau had decided to direct a sequel to The Room. This kind of thing only works if the person who made it is either not fully in on the joke, or if the production was a terrible comedy of errors. There is a genuine earnestness to the first Jack Frost that makes it endearing. The film is not interesting because it is bad. It is interesting because they knew that they blew their entire budget on a terrible snowman costume, but were still determined to do the best that they could in making the best movie that they could, despite what was working against them. But this time, they did their best to make a bad movie on purpose. Everything is done with a wink to the camera. It is too in on the joke, too self-aware to be enjoyable. They are not telling an actual story anymore, but are more so just making fun of everything that actually made that first film work on any artistic level. Cooney recognizes now that this was an issue with this movie, and is what led to it being a failure both in VHS rentals and among fans of the first film, saying retrospectively, "It's almost too self-aware. It was a different experience. By that time, we had money people leaning on us, and there wasn't the freedom we had on the first one. It was still a nice experience, but not like on the first one." It's kinda like the whole Sharknado sequel thing all over again. This thing becomes a lot less enjoyable to deal with if the people making it are just trying to see how crazy things can go, with no artistry or purpose other than that. Another thing that severely hurts this one is that they shot it on videotape and not actual film. It looks so much worse than the first one that doing these as a double feature is actually a little bit painful. Everything about it feels like a fake movie. And it isn't just the decision to shoot on video that harmed the feel of this, but, that was a big factor. That being said, I do want it to be known that it is still mostly fun. I want that to be clear, just in a vastly different way that suffers from any comparison to the first Jack Frost movie. Cooney is very clearly comfortable in the driver's seat directing and writing small projects like this, even if he isn't giving the same level of passion that he clearly did for his first Jack Frost outing. Even though he's still working in film and television today, this is the last project that he would ever direct, and I think there's something a little sad in that, because I feel like he kind of got the wrong hand of cards in this whole situation. So with all of this, I'm not trying to be mean at all, but when watching this one just on a pure filmmaking level, it does come across like his ability to tell a visual story has devolved from the time that he made the first Jack Frost. But this also isn't really truly entirely his fault if you listen to him talk about what happened around this production. The first film had so many interesting shots. It feels like a genuine film that just happens to have this living killer snowman in it. But here we have a lot of basic 101 issues that are just hard to look past. And it's clear that things were falling apart all around this thing, which is especially hard to ignore considering that this was done for even more money than that first one. For an example, we can look at this scene with Doug Jones in the boat, which is so oversaturated and blown out that you can't really see any details in the sky or the background around him, leaving him just this weird floating object within a mostly white frame. Just all around here, there's a much less careful eye to the visual composition of details. But a big part of this is a result of them being forced to film the movie on videotapes. As he would say, "We struggled with the digital. It looks like it's shot on some handycam. It came from up above to shoot it on video. It's what everyone was doing, and yeah, everyone's doing it, but they had tens of millions of dollars to make it look good. We struggled with it." What it does is, at times, it looks like behind the scenes footage. And in this, it has that issue to me in a way that can actually weirdly come from a larger budget on a project that might not actually need that much money, where the lack of resources that the first one had forced innovation and created part of the magic and charm in that initial outing that is lost in something that technically should be better because it's a larger budget made by the same artists. I think Terrifier 3 recently had a bit of that problem to it, where despite having 10 times the amount of money, it wasn't really successful at hitting the same great vibes that 2 had. Here in Jack Frost 2, it theoretically should be better just based on the fact that they had a full actual working snowman suit, an actual effects budget. But just something intangible is lost that's hard to describe that is immediately felt when experiencing the 2 films. This time around, we have Jack who has managed to survive our last adventure, going on a rampage trying to find and get revenge on Sam, who has traveled to a tropical cabana to try and mentally recover from the events of the first movie. This is supposed to take place soon after that film, but because of the delay in production that led this to being released in 2000, everything in this just feels like it's from an entirely different era. From the cultural way that people are dressed to the way that the film is shot. For most of the runtime, it feels like the aesthetic of a very particular window of Disney theme park infomercials, mainly due to the cinematography and acting decisions going on here. It's kind of a hard thing to describe, but if you grew up watching those advertisements, then you'll hopefully know what I mean based on some of these shots. This, believe it or not, was actually made at a resort over the course of an entire month. But just like the first Jack Frost, they kind of got shafted with the weather. It was the rainy season, and it poured every single day that they were on set, making it a miserable time in general and also affecting the quality of the scenery shots that they could get for the movie, which resulted in them for a second time never getting the visual tone that they really wanted by not being able to shoot as much natural beauty that they had intended. The sets in this also do bother me a little bit. They are largely, it seems, just using the pre-existing buildings on the resort of where they made this, and add little of their own decorative flair to them. Just because it's on an island doesn't mean that it can't be a Christmas movie, and they do little to give it that feel in this one like they had before. I think that if you make a horror film that is branded around Christmas, or really any holiday, then you have to deliver hard there. An aspect I feel that I was also a little disappointed with in Terrifier 3, because based around its trailer and poster, I really felt that they were going to go all out with that visual decorative design. But when you actually sit down and watch the film, it is mostly just relegated to its opening scene, with the rest of the film not feeling tremendously Christmassy to me in its visuals. Although Terrifier certainly does this better than Jack Frost 2 does. It's just that when you say Christmas horror film, I kind of have a very specific idea of what I want there, where every set looks as good as it would in a holiday commercial. That's the mindset of what I'm going into something like this with. I want for Christmas what something like Hocus Pocus is doing for Halloween. I want warm lighting. I want decorations covering nearly every surface. I want texture. And with all of that, I want it contrasted with the horror. And neither Terrifier 3 nor Jack Frost 2 get even close to hitting that ideal look in my opinion. If you go back and look at the footage from the first film, they made sure that every single dollar they had showed up on the screen, with the majority of it going into the decorations budget. They made it feel like a Christmas town, despite having little resources. They were able to make a fully lived-in, textured environment, even going so far as to glue fake snow and frost to the windows, so that you know how cold that it's supposed to be outside. But this has essentially none of that precision that elevated that film beyond just being cheap bargain trash. I read in a thread once where someone said that the original Jack Frost is the ambrosia of cheap garbage direct-to-video home movies, and they're kind of onto something with that. And so maybe even comparing the two is not extremely fair because of the drastic different circumstances that led to their creations. Jack Frost 2 Revenge of the Mutant Killer Snowman is more in line with your average video from this time than not, and is probably more like what you may, off the cuff, would assume that the first one is like just based on its cover and some contextual information about it. It is clear that they had a substantially higher budget this time around, even using copious amounts of bad 90s CGI, which even Cooney now admits was a huge mistake that held the film back from having the same level of personality that that first one did. I can't actually find much information about how this film came to be. It obviously was made after the original had been such a hit on the home video market, and was also released by IPOS Entertainment. But actual information about the pre-production and the funding process of all of this seems to be a little bit hazy as to what's available online. In that deal, however, I'm actually kind of shocked that the production was not contractually obligated to redesign Jack to match his obviously much more cool look that everyone associated with the brand from that original cover. That's the first thing that I would have insisted if my money was going into this thing, which makes me think that whoever was behind this genius marketing of Part 1 was nowhere near this project. because a lot of weird decisions like that are made here that could have been avoided, down to even the box art itself, which is an obvious callback to that original, but is just visually so unappealing in just about every way. It still was lenticular like that first one, but featured a much worse designed monster that was not particularly striking. They didn't even take this picture. It's just a photo bash of a Hawaiian lei with some teeth from the original cover, and the bad snowman costume they weirdly decided to reuse. The only thing original here are the eyes, which are not the eyes from the original box, so I don't know where those came from. One of my least favorite things that a horror franchise can do, which admittedly eventually almost all of them get around to doing, is purposefully going against the established logic or lore of that first film. I think that it is fundamentally against the game of franchise filmmaking. That original entry should be the tone setter, and everything else should fall within the parameters of that, unless there is a very particular and important story reason not to do so. New Nightmare is one of the only ones that I can think of that breaks the internal logic of the first film, that actually makes sense, and overall works both within that entry and also serves to not harm the overall franchise as a whole. Usually if deviations are made in a series, they wait until later entries to do this. But some like Jack Frost unfortunately make the decision to do it right away. Nightmare on Elm Street is actually a good example of this because Part 2 almost completely ignores the events of Part 1 in favor of doing their own worst thing. It's a fun movie, but the franchise was worse because of it. And this should always be avoided because it is very difficult to build an empire on a shoddy foundation. It may be creatively freeing for you in the moment as a storyteller, but that is largely not what you signed up for when you decided to make a sequel, and will always be poison for your audience who are expecting a certain kind of thing within their mind. Here in this movie, they get rid of some of the more interesting elements from the first one. Jack before had the supernatural ability to reconstitute his body into the different forms of water. When desired, he can be snow, he can be ice, steam, or liquid water, basically at will. But within that, he is also bound somewhat to the environment around him. In the climax of that movie, the team use hair dryers to make him melt, and then force him into a crematorium where he turns into steam. And when he escapes from that, they have used that time to build a trap for him out of a tank of antifreeze that they push him into to contain his form. He has abilities that help him hunt, but he also has weaknesses. That makes him a good horror film monster. There are ways that humans have to adapt their ways and their environments if they want to have a hope of taking him on and surviving. And in that, the writer is able to create narrative challenges that create stakes. And in this, it does not make him insurmountable as a foe. It is super important that your monster have things that make him beatable while also remaining scary and dangerous. There is a balance there, a tightrope that needs to be walked. But here we just have the snowman on a beach because it's funny. It disregards the heat and temperature element completely. A momentary visual sight gag that we've already gotten past once we see it on the cover, that robs us of the most effective ways that they could have built tension within the story. But it is one of many things that shows that telling an actual thought-out story this time around that was a solid continuation of their previous efforts was not their ultimate goal. And they don't even fully commit to that joke, which is the worst part of all of this. We never get any scenes of Jack on the beach in the daytime doing resort things like drinking cocktails, or wearing a straw hat, or, joining a pickup volleyball game to show off his skills or anything like that. Like, if you're not going to do the joke, why even do the movie with this setting in the first place? It totally fails to utilize anything that makes this location potentially interesting for the setting of this story. There's also this issue that writers often come into with these franchises, where they have to come up with a new, fresh, interesting story that still exists within the boundaries of this world that has been pre-created for them. We already know that there's a killer snowman on the loose. We already know how he operates, so you can't have that be a mystery this time around in how he functions. So it has to be something new. And unfortunately sometimes, as is the case with, say, The Hills Have Eyes 2, and this movie, they don't really bother to come up with a new thing, instead just opting to have the characters just hang out and waste time, doing nothing until the killer inevitably shows back up, which is one of my least favorite types of horror sequels. You've got to come up with some kind of new story that is both entertaining while also retroactively making the first film even better. Sequels are all about building legacy and longevity within a franchise, and this largely fails to do both of those things, which is part of the reason that we never got more of these. But ignoring the lesser issues about this, there are actually some good things that we can say about it as well. The first being that I'm glad that Cooney actually got to make this. He clearly enjoys being the Jack Frost guy, and seems to view protecting these films as important. And even though I didn't love it, I'm glad that he as an artist got another chance to do one of these if that's what he likes to do. All art in some way should serve to the joy of the person who's making it. So seeing that Jack Frost even happened does make me happy. But I will say that if you're going to do these types of hang out until the killer shows up movies, then you've got to at least make it interesting for the audience when he does finally show up. And that is where this movie really succeeds. It is clear that in the first one, they had no idea how to use the suit in any convincing way. And so most of the time you see him, he's just standing completely still. You know, invoking a real snowman. And you've got a little bit of that here. But the sheer level of mayhem and Looney Tunes kills is really something to appreciate with this, and goes above and beyond in an aspect that the first film somewhat lacked. I mean, a character literally gets a snow anvil dropped on their head at one point. From the time that Jack shows up all the way to the very end where he gets transformed into a snow kaiju, it is at least crazy in a mostly entertaining way. And for the VHS era, that is kind of what you're wanting with something like this. There's a scene in this movie where Jack gets pregnant and lays a nest of snowball eggs that then hatch into murderous snow child killers reminiscent of the facehugger in Alien and the Gremlins. When the humans learn the weakness of Jack's child soldiers, a battle is waged and all of his egg-born babies are disposed of. Jack, later in the forest, holds the body of one of his fallen children and sheds a single tear. And then when seeking revenge, Jack corners Anne, Sam's wife, who led the charge against the army of snow children, and he screams in anger, "I just rode into town and I'm looking for the bitch who killed my family." It's just that kind of movie, and I don't really know what to say else about it. Like, it's the kind of thing that just sort of has to be experienced, and is difficult to write at length about. These kinds of films are the hardest for me to review because there's just not a lot to do with the material as far as analysis is concerned. When there's so little substance to the text, what is there really to talk about? I once wrote half a franchise video on Wishmaster, but the third and fourth movies are so bizarre that I gave up even trying, and never ended up even making the video. And the same could be said for Jack Frost 2, which ultimately ended up being the last film made in the series. And if there were 4 more of them, then I likely would not have made a video on them. Which all of this is kind of a shame to me, because with a different direction, we could have had another Leprechaun-esque video market franchise. They could have easily run for many more entries if they had played their cards right, and not gone too over the top and crazy with this one. On top of that though, Jack Frost kind of missed the window of opportunity necessary to build a successful franchise out of this particular style. The first Leprechaun movie came out in 1993, only 1 year before Jack Frost was made, but at the point of Jack Frost 2, they had already made 5 direct-to-video Leprechaun films. Arguably, the most successful years of that age of home video renting supremacy ranged from like 90 to 2000, which 2000 was the year that Jack Frost 2 was released. And soon after that, we moved into the time of things like The Ring, Final Destination, and Saw within horror. And there somewhat was no longer the same size of market for this kind of work. People say that Netflix killed the video store, which is only a half-truth. Because to be honest and fully objective about the situation, they were already on their way out the door by the arrival of the DVD. The reason that video rental stores became a huge thing in the first place was because VHS tapes were initially so expensive that nobody wanted to buy them. A single tape in today's money, when adjusted for inflation, would have been worth roughly $145 back in 1985. They were economically unreasonable. But DVDs were so much cheaper to produce and purchase that many people began to just outright buy them instead of rent them, so that you could have access to them forever. I mean, you didn't see CD rental shops, did you? If movies launched on the home market with a cheaper option than they did, then video rental stores would have never even become a thing in the first place. On top of that, with emerging online activities, video games, expanding cable networks, people became much less reliant on movies as their sole form of entertainment. There were a lot of factors working against the empire of Blockbuster that I think aren't often talked about in favor of the more simplistic view of streaming being the big enemy there. And so while people continued to use rental stores up through roughly 2010 or so, Blockbuster's most profitable year as a company was 2002. And it is undeniable that the direct-to-video market began its slow crash around that point, and then hobbled for the next decade until its eventual death. And while there were certainly many direct-to-video movies that were produced on up to today, the ability to profit off of them was substantially disrupted for a time in that shift to DVD and Blu-ray, and many other things took their low-budget place like sci-fi original films. And this time of uncertainty is the exact place that this franchise found itself in. And so, unfortunately, with a disappointing and poorly produced sequel as well as the economic reality of the situation, not even to mention the death of their main star, the interest in further outings of the murderous Jack Frost kind of faded into the snowy wastes. Cooney has, since directing the Jack Frost films, has stepped away from directing and focused his career entirely on being a screenwriter. He wrote the James Mangold film Identity, as well as Shelter, starring Julianne Moore. In that same interview with Fangoria, he said, "I don't think anyone should let me anywhere near a camera again, unless they want to make Jack Frost 3. Then I'm the perfect guy for the job. Once you've seen what a good director can do, once you see how they elevate your piece and make it so much more, you hand it over and trust them." As for Jack Frost 3, it was actually almost a reality, which, as he revealed, would have picked up right at the end of the second film, resolving the cliffhanger of Jack Frost going through the chemical mutation of turning into a kaiju. And we would have watched his Godzilla-style rampage as he attacked a city. It would have been called Jack Frost 3, Jackzilla. As he said, "I started writing Jack Frost 3. There's about 20 pages somewhere. At the end of part 2, there's this screaming, 'Jackzilla, Jackzilla,' and this giant carrot drops on the boat. The next one started off 10 years later, and the kid is all grown up. It was going to be set in a city, and Jackzilla, this giant snowman, attacks a skyscraper, enveloping it and killing people by coming through the vents and all that. Digital effects have come down in price by now, and I think we could do it. If someone wants to make it, I would adore the opportunity. It holds such a special place in my heart." But that has been many years ago now, and the likelihood of seeing the giant snowman anytime soon seems to be a slim chance, unfortunately. Which is a shame because, I would...
Hang up the stockings, turn the lights down low, dream a dream of Christmas morn as off to bed you go. Hang up the stockings, and when good nights are said, dream a dream of Christmas morn, there's lots of fun ahead. Hang up the stockings, and when good nights are said, dream a dream of Christmas morn, there's lots of fun ahead. So rest your sleepy head.
Good night, Mommy. Good night, Daddy.